So I was actually born in the Netherlands. So that's I learned to ride a bike early, like every Dutch person does. And so through 2 Federal Reserve banks, I ended up at Arizona State University. I know Conchita from NYU from a while back, so this is the graduation picture from there. And for inflation, what I'm talking about today, the other thing that might be irrelevant or not is I serve on the technical advisory committee at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where I talk about measuring inflation frequently with people in the US. Not that I have that much to say often, but so I'm going to talk to you about households, about inflation inequality, but I want to kind of first do this. I want to put you in a conceptual framework. If we do national income and product accounting, when we think of the household sector, we think about recording flows in and out of the household's wealth, basically. So we're looking at their sources of income and then their uses of income. So today I'll basically talk about those. It's called a household sector T account in the national income and product accounts, but it's basically an income statement for the household sector. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask myself 2 questions, and I'll give you some answers as well. I owe you some answers, I'll give you some answers. So the first one is, because households tend to buy different goods and baskets of goods when they spend, what is that effect on, they can have those baskets of goods can increase in prices very differently. And our cost of living index, or our inflation measure, is measuring the percentage increase in the cost of that basket of goods. Different baskets of goods, different inflation rates. So how big are those differences? I'll discuss a little bit of the research that I did for the United States and some other research that I'm familiar with for the UK, and I'll present you some results with data from Eurostat that I calculated for this presentation, so they're new, to compare them across countries. So I'll do that. And then the second thing I'll discuss with you, a little bit more informally, but I think ultimately it's at the end of the day most of the policy relevant results for this presentation about how different people are exposed to inflation rates. Now at the moment, inflation in Europe is unexpectedly low. Actually, it's low, unexpectedly low everywhere in the world. But that might not always be the case. So if there's unexpectedly high inflation being realized, who's exposed to that more? And you'll see that the distributional consequences of that are higher than the actual measures or the degree of inequality and inflation across households. So that's what I'll show. So those are my main takeaways. If I look at inequality in inflation experiences across households, I actually find very little inequality in the euro area. If I do a very similar analysis for other countries, I find much more. In fact, it's only about 0.15 percentage points. Now, if you know that inflation is also not measured that precisely, this is way within the margin of error at which inflation is measured. So there's substantially less variation in inflation across households than there is in the UK and the US. And I'll explain a little bit about why that is. It's actually a direct consequence of policies because it has to do with medical and education prices. Then the other thing I'll show you is inequality around inflation exposure, and there you see this varies a lot across the income distribution, and I think it's higher. I haven't done a whole lot of research on this, but I'll show you some results that suggest that this is actually also higher than in other countries where households tend to invest in a more broader portfolio of assets, and where home ownerships are higher than in some European countries as well. So let's talk about inflation experiences first. And to put this all in context, you could look at, let's just start with kind of the inequality and inflation that you're probably more familiar with, which is cross countries. So this is the average annualized inflation rate across the euro area countries. This is the broad euro area on the left, which I must say I get a little bit confused always what the definitions of euro area are on the Eurostat website. So I took the constant just the euro areas that exist, but then these are kind of the 12 original countries that on the right. But what you see is that and if you think about the average inflation rate, which has been below 2% over this period, you see that there's variation around even the average inflation rate. So in Greece and Ireland, also countries probably that were hit harder by the crisis, inflation has been lower. And other countries, inflation actually runs about a percentage point to 1.5 percentage points higher. So this gap is about 1.5 percentage points. Now remember that this is averaged over 6 years. So 6 times 1.5% is still about well, now I'm putting myself, it's about 9%. Compound, maybe 10%. So that's actually still a substantial movement in relative prices if you look at this. Now, there's a lot of discussion in the euro area about how this compares to relative wage rates and competitiveness, but I'm not going to talk about that. There's a large discussion about inflation rate differentials across countries. But you also have to realize is underlying all of these inflation rates are these baskets of goods that people buy. And so those baskets are, the components of that basket themselves have very different inflation rates. So if you look at the inflation rates across different components of the basket of the goods, and I'm going to report everything at what we call the COICOP 1 level. So this is 10 categories of goods that make up households' consumption spending. Food and non-alcoholic beverages, alcohol and tobacco, where you see excise tax rates having a big effect on inflation. But you see that if I look at the vertical axis here, this axis runs from 4% to 7%. So across goods, the inflation differentials are much higher than across countries. So bear that in mind. Which means that, you know, if you're an alcoholic, and I hope you're not, but if you are, you're going to face a substantially higher inflation rate because you spend money on goods whose prices go up at around 4% a year, right? If you are a cell phone-aholic, a cell-aholic, then you're doing well because the prices tend to decline over time. So choose your poison between alcohol and cell phones. Cell phones are cheaper in the long run, I guess. The bottom line is this. If you look at these different components, you see very big differences across these components. Now, then the question is if households spend differently across those goods, is this going to be reflected in differences in their inflation rates? So what do households spend their money on? Here's the data for the euro area. Hiccup weights. These are actually, I say hiccup weights. They're not the formal weights. These are the expenditure weights that we get when we aggregate the household budget survey in the euro area over those 10 COICOP categories. So this is the fraction of spending households do on these different goods. I have the total spending, the average, and then I also have ranked them in terms of income quantile. It turns out that if you look at different groupings of households, in differences in inflation rate based on this level of aggregation of Eurostat data are the most significant across income quintiles. So this is the reason I'm showing this. What you're showing is if you know some theory, we often assume that preferences are homothetic, which is a complicated word for saying if your income goes up, you still keep on spending the same share of your income on different goods. But that's not how households behave. And you see that here, because when you get richer, you spend a smaller fraction of your money on goods. You spend more on transportation. I guess you hop more on planes, presumably. You spend a lot less on housing and utilities, but you start spending some more on restaurants and on recreation, which effectively are luxury goods, right? So our price indices are calculated at the aggregate level, assuming preferences are homothetic, but really they're not. And so this is capturing kind of the income effect of on people's spending patterns, and you see how that works. So then we can ask ourselves the following question. If it's true that households have different goods baskets that they buy, how is that then going to affect the increase in the cost of those goods baskets, because the components of that goods basket, the price of those components go up at very different rates. So that's the question that this literature on inflation inequality has addressed over the years. It's based on early papers. The most famous paper in this literature is a paper by Bob Pollock on group price indices. And the common way we do this is to take the variation in spending pattern across households and take that into account. And then we're going to assume that households face the same inflation rates for all those goods. So let me discuss that a little bit. That's not always the most satisfying assumption, but we don't really know across, if you want to calculate the variation in the inflation rates of, say, alcohol or housing for different groups, you need to measure literally which households of which type by which goods and how quickly those prices go up. But we collect price quotes in the CPI separately. We don't know who buys the goods, whose price quotes we actually measure in the CPI. So we don't have much data that links that. There's recent research on this using the research panel, the Nielsen retail panel in the United States, and people have done some research on it. It does seem to indicate that poorer households shift more quickly towards imported goods that are cheap, so imported t-shirts and stuff. But this is all very early research. What we do know in the United States, I don't know exactly how this is in Europe, but in poorer neighborhoods prices tend to be higher. And so in very poor and urban neighborhoods prices tend to be higher, and so households in poorer urban neighborhoods tend to buy at outlets that are more expensive. So this is sometimes called outlet bias in the CPI. Now what's also true is that there's not a lot of evidence that prices are higher there, but that they go up at a different rate from other outlets. Now this is an older literature. I'm not aware that there's a lot of recent evidence on this. And I'm not aware of any evidence on this in Europe. It might be there, and I'd like to hear about it if there is. But you can ask yourself the question, if poorer households shop more at Aldi and Lidl, I'm Dutch, so part of those are the kind of the cheap grocery stores in the Netherlands, and richer households shop more at, say, Albert Heijn in the Netherlands, does it matter for inflation? Only if in those supermarkets the prices go up at different rates is that going to matter for our inflation rates. The levels don't matter because we're measuring growth rates, we're not measuring levels, so that's something to bear in mind. So that's on this assumption. If you impose that assumption, and I wrote a paper on this in 2005 with David Lagakos, who's a professor at UC San Diego now, then you can make these calculations. So here are those calculations across income quintiles for the United States, for Europe, sorry. So these are group inflation rates by income quintile. I'm reporting the same growth rates. So these are average annualized growth rates from January 2010 to January 2016. And I've done it for the euro area, and I've shown you the results. Italy has dropped out. This should be the 5 biggest countries economically in Europe, but for some reason the expenditure patterns by income were not reported on the Eurostat webpage for Italian. So for those of you who are Italian, I know there's no lack of Italians in this room. I'm very sorry that that there's no Italian results here. But what you're seeing is this. If you do this, then this is kind of the overall inflation rate. It's going to be slightly different from the hiccup because I'm using a Lasper's price index with this goods basket from the household budget surveys being fixed. So it's not methodologically exactly the same, but it's very close. And what you're seeing is that poor households tend to pay slightly higher inflation rate. Right, they have a slightly higher inflation rate. So this is, in the euro area, it's 1.6. For the poorer households, lower income, it's 1.67, and richer households, 1.54. I guess they spent more money on transportation, but especially on cell phones. So. But this is not an enormous difference. It's, it's 0.13 percentage points. And this result is actually very, very similar across countries. If you do this calculation at the same level of aggregation for the United States, for example, you get much bigger differences. But you get them even bigger if you look at them. For different types of households, as I'll show you later, for which there's very little difference here. What is the reason for this? The reason is that at the end of the day, what matters for the income, for the inflation inequality in the United States are medical care prices and education prices, whose inflation rates are substantially higher. You're talking about 5 to 7% a year. They've gone down a little after the Obamacare reform for medical care prices. But what happens is that in the United States, it's elderly households and it's households with kids who face the higher inflation rates because they spend a lot on medical care and they spend a lot on education. This is a sensitive result because the CPI in the United States is used to index Social Security benefits. And so but the recipients of Social Security benefits are not the average urban households for which they use the indexation. They're elderly people. And so the fact that those people don't face an inflation rate that's the same as the one that's captured in the inflation measure is a sensitive topic. Now, the same argument holds here, which is if you think about how many things in Europe are indexed to inflation, substantially many more things than actually in the United States, then it's important to know these differences because it might mean that indexation might unfairly compensate people who face a lower than average inflation rate and unfairly cut people short who face a higher than average inflation rate. But these results seem to suggest those differences are very small. So that's a good thing. I think that what it says is if you look at European data, indexation to the overall price level seems to relatively fairly compensate people for increases in the cost of living no matter who they are. So this is the result that you see that poor households have a slightly higher inflation rate, but it's much smaller, this differential, than when I actually look at the data for the US. And also for data for the UK. There's a paper by the Office of National Statistics that does this calculation for the UK. You get substantially higher inflation differentials. So then you can ask yourself, it might not be income, it might be something else that causes these differences. So let's look at other groups across other groups of households and ask ourselves, what are the differences? So I've used the three classifications that are available from the Eurostat webpage. Socioeconomic status, which is basically worker status. The composition of the household. And the age of the head of the household. And I've listed just the group with the highest and the lowest inflation rates, just to give you some sense of the group categories. These numbers are only for the euro area. If you actually do the country by country, you get very similar results. So the euro area or country by country analysis is giving you very similar results. And the results are just that these differences in inflation rates across goods. Here's the one for which you would get a really big difference in the United States, a much bigger difference, let's say this way. But it's really not that large here at all. It's about a tenth of a percentage point between young and old households. It's not nothing, but within, I would say actually within the margin of error of the measurement of inflation overall. So that surprised me, I must say, when I started calculating this and looked at the European data, that there's so much less variation in these data than there is in the numbers that I'm familiar with for the United States. So that's my first takeaway, which is I wouldn't be that concerned about an inequality and inflation rate across households in Europe. That actually seems to be relatively low. And it seems to be largely because in other countries this is driven by medical care and education prices, but since those are largely government controlled here, you just get you get these inflation rates that are lower. They're not reflecting differences at all. And, remember that in the United States, inflation on average is also about 2%. So if you have very high education and medical care inflation, that needs to be offset by much lower inflation in other categories in order to average out to 2%. So you get much bigger variation, or maybe not much bigger, but you get bigger variation in inflation across goods categories. So I think that's a good thing. I think the most important thing is if you think about policies that focus on indexing benefits or income, and you think that's a desirable thing to do, you can argue whether it's desirable or not, but if you decide to do that, then you want to do it fairly. And so, and this seems to suggest that this indexation for European countries as well as for Europe as a whole seems to be relatively fair across different household groups. So I think that's a really positive and useful result. So the next thing is to think about exposure to inflation. This will be a little bit less formal than the previous calculation. But let's just think about the ECB starting to helicopter drop some money across the euro area, and we get unanticipatedly high inflation. Then what would we do? Who would actually be hurt or benefit the most from this? Now, the first thing you have to bear in mind is inflation is a tax, right? We tend to think of inflation as something else, but once you put it, you think through it, inflation is a tax, and it's a tax, its tax base is money, cash. That's the tax base in inflation. So so payments, monetary payments are subject to an inflation tax. So the real question is then, who's going to bear the brunt of an inflation tax? So how can you be exposed to an inflation tax? Through the different sources of income you have, because they might not might not be indexed to inflation, so they might adjust when inflation goes up or down, as well as through your savings. So I'm going to show you some evidence on basically the sources of income and the capital side of households' accounts. But let's first talk about compensation. There's a lot of different studies on wage indexation. I'll just show you one. Now, the issue with wage indexation is that it protects real wages, right? So if you index wages, wages will always be adjusted for the inflation rate. Now, there's some reasons that may be macroeconomically desirable or not. I'll leave that out, but if your goal is to do this, then what's happening? So there's a couple of ways of thinking about wage indexation. This is I'm citing here a paper by the ECB Wage Flexibility Project, and they did a survey on the prevalence of wage indexation across firms. Now, some of you might know more about it than I do. So there's actually a national level of indexation plus kind of the firm level of indexation. So this evidence shows for firm level of indexation. There's two ways of thinking about it. You either index automatically to past inflation, which, by the way, macroeconomists would not advise you to do so because that will cause a wage price spiral and it's really hard to remain in control. You could automatically adjust to expected inflation, or you could informally but often do an adjustment based on past inflation or expected inflation. The total number of firms that report they do this in the euro area is about a third. I think this is actually worker weighted. So I should say the total number of workers, the fraction of workers that are under such regimes is about a third. That's actually lower than I expected, but that's largely because then at the country level, there are also bargaining agreements that also make indexation more common. So overall, indexation is still pretty common. Now, this is a talk about inequality, so let's think about what the consequences are. So if you think about wage indexation and inflation, then in principle, wage indexation it could be a good thing because it means that the purchasing power of people's wages, people's real wages, cannot go down, right? Because you always raise wages at the rate of inflation. Now, I do want to say, by the way, that this is pre-crisis evidence and that these numbers might have changed a little bit in response to the crisis. The most important thing about these policies related to inflation is if you do wage indexation, right, and you say, I'm going to hedge workers against inflation risks, and I'm going to say, your wages cannot go down when inflation unexpectedly goes up. That's nice, but firms need to adjust one way or the other. So if they can't lower real wages and there's a really deep crisis, then what this will happen is it will cause an insider and outsider effect. This is very good news for workers who will be hedged against inflation if they remain employed. But it's going to keeping workers expensive for firms. So what firms in practice do is they will then adjust through the actual extensive margin and they will lay people off. So policies like wage indexation, if we think about them being fair because they hedge people against inflation, you have to realize that they have very heterogeneous effects through the people who remain employed, the insiders, and the people who are not employed and are less likely to find a job, or the people who get laid off. So it's something that often gets ignored when we discuss wage indexation adjustments for inflation, but sometimes we actually want wages to go down at lower than the inflation rate. We want real wages to go down. And so having wage indexation will prevent that from happening, and it's actually not such a desirable thing. But if you're subject to indexed wages, that's nice because that hedges a large part of your income to about 60% of income in the national income and product accounts, labor income. So that's a big source of income then that's protected. So then we can think about other types of capital. And what looms large is, if you think about households' assets and capital income, is housing. And so I'll look at that first. But overall, if you want to think about how exposed are people to inflation, you really want to think about, besides wage indexation, about what they invest their money in. What assets do they hold? How are the return on those assets dependent on unexpected inflation rates? So that's the final thing that I'd like to discuss with you. And here's where you see really big differences across households. and also big differences between Europe and other countries. So the first thing to realize is that the most people's most important source of wealth is housing. Now, if you rent and inflation occurs, then unless you rent in a rent-stabilized area, if there's unexpected inflation, your rents will go up with inflation. And so your expenses on your housing expenses are not hedged against inflation at all. So renters, in terms of their housing spending and their housing market, are hurt the most. Now, if you rent in a rent-stabilized area, it looks like your housing price does not go up when inflation goes up, but what in practice happens is if house prices, if rents are stabilized and they don't keep up with market rents because they're stabilized, landlords basically start reducing maintenance. So your quality adjusted rent is still going up. And you should talk to people in Berkeley and New York City, where that's been really a big issue for the housing stock. Then if you own, two things happen. I mean, if you have a fixed rate mortgage, that's even better, because then you're really hedged against inflation, because your nominal spending on your mortgage is going to be constant over time because it's amortized. So your nominal spending goes up, the inflation rate goes up, so the real value of the spending on your mortgage expenses is going to go down. That's great. And so, you know, the best for people who have just gotten a 30-year fixed rate mortgage in Europe, I don't know how common it is, make it a 10-year one. I just got a 30-year fixed rate mortgage in Arizona. If inflation goes up, I have the best of both worlds. I have an interest rate that's fixed under low inflation, and inflation goes up, so my monthly housing spending would be really low in real terms going forward. Now, on top of that, you know, the underlying collateral actually increases in value, right? Because house prices will actually start moving when inflation goes up. So you are actually, to some extent, a fixed rate mortgage, you're kind of, you're going short or long. I think you're going long on inflation in many ways in your investment. So, so homeowners really benefit from unanticipated inflation. Now, and because home ownership rates are so different across households, and then how the value of their houses is also different. So I'm using data here from the European Household Finance and Consumption Survey, which is the basically the euro area equivalent of the survey of consumer finances. So I'm not reporting home ownership rates, I'm just reporting their wealth level. If you look at the home ownership rates, you get similar differences. So, so I show you different countries. I don't have Luxembourg in here, but it will be substantially higher everywhere since house prices here are so much higher. And I think home ownership rates here are also higher, if I remember the statistics correctly. So unanticipated inflation will really benefit you as a homeowner in Luxembourg. Now, what you see is that that this is again organized by the income quinta, or there's actually the decile. And so what you see is across income groups, you know, what people have in terms of the value of their house varies a lot. Rich households definitely have much more valuable houses, but this is really an investment that pays off when unanticipated inflation happens. So across the income distribution, both through home ownership rates as well as through the value of the housing main residence, and then some richer households don't only have a main residence, they have a secondary residence. Those people are really going to benefit if inflation goes up. And you get this very unequal coverage in terms of exposure to inflation. This is
percentage of what? The y-axis.
Oh, no, that's a very good question. And this is a labeling mistake. This is thousands of euros. This is the actual...
Makes a lot more sense. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Not asleep yet.
No, well, I'm glad you're waking up on my labeling mistake. Yeah, so this is actually, my apologies. This is a labeling mistake. This is the nominal value in thousands of euros of a house. Yeah. And this is from the survey. This is actually held across different years. So most countries this was done in 2010. But it is true, I think, for Spain, some of the households were surveyed before 2010, so that might not include some of the decline in their house value. Yeah? Yeah. So besides housing, what we could do is, so housing is the household's most important real asset. So besides housing, what you could do is look at what households actually have in terms of their financial assets. I've done this by country because I couldn't get the summary statistics by income level, but you could also do it by income level. I know the data for the US, I can discuss a little bit through it. What you do find in Europe though is, so I've ordered them and colored them in a way that I think it makes sense in the terms of, it goes from deposits to bonds to pensions to mutual funds, shares, and then others. And I've ordered them such that these are the ones that are most exposed to inflation. So if you held those in your portfolio, if inflation would happen, you would be more exposed to inflation. Now,
Percentage on the x-axis, I think.
Yeah. This is country, and this is percent.
I feel with you, I'm dyslexic too.
Yep, this is country and this is percent, and I'm glad you're not asleep yet either, because now, yep. So this is kind of the composition of their financial asset portfolio. And what you're finding is, one is that Europeans actually have a substantially larger part of their assets in deposits and bonds than people in the UK and in the US. Now, some of that reflects income inequality because richer people tend to have more in financial markets, but my understanding of looking at the data is that it's even true for households in the lower end of the income distribution. So if unexpected inflation happens, you would find that households through their financial assets at the lower end of the income distribution are disproportionately exposed to inflation. Now, I put this in orange, pensions, because in many countries indexation is something is the first thing on the chopping block when budget cuts need to be made to the pension system. So there's many different proposals. Russia recently basically adjusted it's not part of the euro area, I'm aware of it, it's also not part of the United States, but it cut its indexation of pensions. I know that in the Netherlands some of that has happened. And in the United States this is a discussion as well, whether we should change the price index to which we index Social Security benefits in order to basically reduce the growth of the spending on the benefits. So that's why I made that orange, because you basically have, these are not fully insured against inflation, even though you might be assured of some real benefit going forward. If you invest in financial markets, clearly if you hold money in the financial sector, those banks that underwrite those 30-year fixed rate mortgages, some of those banks might also take a hit in their asset value when the inflation occurs. But overall, the stock market tends to be, the real returns in the stock market tend to be less affected by inflation than these other sources. And this is true in Europe, so there's a higher exposure to these financial assets, but especially also true across different quintiles of the income distribution. So you see a very large share of financial assets in classes that are disproportionately exposed to inflation risks, and those are generally held disproportionately by lower income households. So inequality and inflation exposure it varies a lot across the wealth and the income distribution. And it's important because if you think about the consequences of monetary and fiscal policy, a lot of it goes through people's asset side, not through their spending side. So if you think about monetary policy, as I told you already, inflation is a tax. So you have to ask yourself, if you're a proponent of progressive taxation, which in most countries is the reality for income taxes, maybe not for value-added taxes, but for income taxes at least, then you have to be aware that if you're going to have higher inflation rates, either unanticipated or anticipated, it's going to disproportionately affect households that are more exposed to that, and those are people who tend to be at lower part of the income distribution. Now, fiscal policy, which is actually in the short run probably more relevant, because most of us think that monetary policy, unless there's major changes in the independence of central banks in the euro area, in the UK and the United States, we think there's a pretty credible 2% inflation target. But on the fiscal policy side, there have been reductions in indexation of benefits, and those things really tend to hit harder households that rely more on those benefits. So again, those are cases where exposure to inflation risk or exposure to not being compensated for increases in inflation are very unequally distributed. So those are the two main takeaways. I think that the result that surprised me the most when I started preparing this with the knowledge that I have about inflation differences in the United States is that if you think about inflation in Europe, you would think that it would hit households relatively differently across groups. But actually, inflation differences across households tend to be relatively small in Europe, to the extent that we can measure it based on published Eurostat data. And that's, I think, a very positive message. It means if things that are indexed to inflation index people relatively fairly, there's no distributional consequences to that indexation. So that, I think, is actually a very positive result. However, I would think about, if you think about policies that either change the way we compensate people for inflation or change the inflation in an anticipated way, those policies have substantial distributional effects because of the asset holding of households and because largely through the housing market but also through their financial assets. Now, that I think is something that you should, if you're concerned about inequality, which you presumably are, otherwise you wouldn't be here, is something you should really take very seriously when you consider such policy alternatives. And I know that in many countries these kind of calculations are part of every year's budget considerations, and but that's important to bear in mind, both for monetary and fiscal policy. So that's it.
Okay,